Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
The Print Off the Cuff, presented by IIFL Wealth and Asset Management, corporate partner AU Small Finance Bank, in association with global insurance brokers, airline partner SpiceJet, in alliance with Indraprastha Apollo Hospitals, and in association with Jindal Steel and Power Limited.
Welcome to this very thoughtful, what promises to be a very thoughtful episode of Off the Cuff. Thoughtful, not just because between my co-host, that is Gurcharan Das, author, corporate leader, and now a philosopher also, and Jerry Rao, again a corporate leader, investor, now a philosopher. Between the three of us, we pack more than 200 years of experience, but also because we have something very interesting to talk about. And that is Jerry Rao's book, Jaithirth Rao's book on Economist Gandhi. Now, we know of Gandhi as a politician Gandhi, as a philosopher Gandhi, as a mass leader Gandhi, but somehow Economist Gandhi, and we even know Gandhi as a soldier Gandhi because he served as at least as a nurse in a war. But somehow we don't know him as Economist Gandhi. So the format is that Gurcharan and I will be asking Jerry questions. And let me just get started. Jerry, what is Economist Gandhi and why the book?
Yeah, Shekhar, the thing that I got interested in Gandhi about 10 odd years ago, when Ira Pandey of the India International Center asked me to write something about Gandhian thought and corporate governance. And as you know, given my intellectual predilections, I've always been a great admirer of the Raj. So I was never a great Gandhi fan when I started this exercise. But over a 10, 12-year period, I have now moved to the other extreme of becoming a great admirer of Gandhi. And it comes from a very different perspective. I think most foreigners look at Gandhi from his political tactics, nonviolence, civil disobedience, Mandela, Martin Luther King, Lech Walesa, everybody being influenced by Gandhi, and Judith Brown and people like that talking about Gandhi. And there's this, every political science course in any major university in the world, there will be one section on Gandhi. But Indians, on the other hand, we tend to look at Gandhi very judgmentally. Did Gandhi make a mistake when he stopped Satyagraha after Chauri Chaura? Did Gandhi make a mistake supporting Khilafat? Did he make a mistake starting Quit India? So it's all judgmental, retrospective, political judgments, if you will. I think in the process, two aspects of Gandhi. One, that he was an intellectual and a philosopher going beyond political techniques. An extremely important seminal intellectual thinker of the 20th century, anywhere in the world, not just in India, gets forgotten. And the reason I chose economics is certainly because everybody associates Gandhi with wearing a dhoti and reducing his needs and being anti-consumer and to some extent Luddite and anti-industry and so on. Somehow there is no connection between Gandhi and modern economics as we understand it. And I'm trying to dispel that notion. Actually, there are several areas where Gandhi's intellectual contributions, I'm not talking now about political whataboutery, I'm talking about intellectual contributions of a great weight. There is one chapter in my book, for instance, which is called Adam Smith and the Mahatma, where I am doing analogies between the great Scottish Enlightenment moral philosopher and the father of political economy, Adam Smith, and Gandhi. There is another chapter on Gandhi and identity economics, where I talk about his relationship with Akerlof and Cranton's new field of identity economics, which is related to Taylor's behavioral economics. So Gandhi really has a lot to contribute. And above all, of course, most of the book is devoted to this. The original 1776 Wealth of Nations problem of the agency problem articulated by Adam Smith, which is that I am the principal and I give you money, you're my manager or agent, and you have an incentive to steal from me, to be lazy with my money. How does one avoid that? And a lot of economic thinking over the last 200 years, 250 years has been about what kind of contracts can we have, what kind of laws can we have. I think Gandhi's extremely important contribution, of course, these agency problems and these kinds of knotty problems can never be completely resolved. But I think we can get fresh insights and we can move towards some resolution. Through his trusteeship doctrine, Gandhi really has made an extraordinary contribution in that area. I have traced in the book, I've not only looked at Gandhi's contributions, but also the roots. That's why the book says the roots and the relevance of the Mahatma's ideas in political economy. What are the roots? Where did Gandhi gain his ideas from?
Jerry, before you give away all your book, your entire book, we want people to be buying it and reading it. Let me ask Gurcharan to step in and take this conversation forward. Because Gurcharan in many ways is of the same, of a similar bent as you, but I don't know what his views on the Raj are, but I know where his views on the political economy are.
Well, Jerry, congratulations.
Thank you.
The first thing to say is that I enjoyed reading your book. And I was very happy to see that there was a freshness about it. And it's somewhat the kind of freshness when I first read a book on Gandhi, which was written by my tutor, my freshman tutor in college, named Anthony Parel.
Excellent guy. Excellent guy.
Yeah, I think that was a very revealing, it was on Swadeshi, a lot of it, but it was certainly an eye-opener for me. So I now have two friends who are intimately connected with Gandhi scholarship. And let me actually pursue just now. You opened the door. I think there are two big relevancies in your book that are relevant to us today. One, of course, is Swadeshi, and we'll come back to that. And you know where I stand. I'm very, very upset with what's going on right now with regard to Swadeshi. But let's go to trusteeship. And you know, basically, I think it'll be worth your talking about what exactly trusteeship is in Gandhi's idea, instead of my trying to paraphrase you. My understanding of trusteeship goes to the core of a market economy. The word trusteesh comes from trust.
Correct.
And trust is the central idea, as every Marwadi businessman knows. The word we use in North India and in Marwar is sak. Sak means trust, that the businessman's life hangs on that word. You could get hundis if there was sak. And the notion that you today, trillions of dollars are transacted in the world economy, not through having contracts between people, but because of trust. The taxi driver who takes me in his taxi, he trusts me that at the end of the journey, I'll pay him. He won't have to break my legs or do any of those things. Or if I give you a check, you accept it without saying, "Oh, what is your balance, by the way?" You accept it in trust. So it's a very central idea in the market economy. And what I've liked about the notion of trusteeship is that it is it dances around two very central ideas that Adam Smith also talked about, which is the idea of one, individual self-interest, second, selfishness. There is a difference. People think that if just because you're operating in the market, you are selfish, you're greedy. But actually, it's much more self-interest, meaning if there's raining outside, you carry an umbrella. Nothing selfish about that. So the idea of trusteeship, where the trust goes in society between generations, the wealth you create is wealth that is to be, you got it from society and you're giving it for the next generation to society. And it also deals, Jerry, and this is what I would be interested more in your illuminating, how much of our wealth should we actually give away? You know, I know that you know the story in the Panchatantra is a dialogue between an old merchant who is successful and the young man who's got a startup, and he's gone to him for advice. And the merchant teaches him, says, well, look, you must know four things about it. One, how to make money. Okay. So if you learn that,
how to make money.
Second, once you've made it, how do you conserve it? How do you make it grow? Don't put it under the carpet. Make it grow. The third thing you must learn is how to spend money. He says that most merchants, most people either are too thrifty or too extravagant. You know, they're stingy or mean, and otherwise they blow up. The thing that you must learn is to give away money in your lifetime. Those people who talk glibly that the Indians never gave away money are totally wrong. Anyway, coming back to Gandhi and trusteeship, my point, also the trusteeship is, and you know, particularly today, when Bill Gates has been talking about the pledge, giving 50% of your money away, I think all these things impinge, and that's what makes this relevant, particularly after 2008, when the market economy is on the defense.
I think, Shekhar, 2008 was not just an economic downturn.
Right.
2008 has made us revisit much of the moral basis of modern market capitalism. Words like predatory, greedy, super greedy became the way to describe a lot of behavior. And the very foundations of market capitalism, the very foundations of the Thatcher-Reagan revolution, if you will, have been questioned. And there needs to be a new kind of opening up on that. And unfortunately, most of that has been technocratic. Let's do something, let's pass Frank Dodd bill, let's do some new regulatory compliance, rather than trying to revisit some underlying moral underpinnings of market capitalism. Gurcharan, are you back?
I was saying that particularly after 2008 and the inequality, the Piketty phenomena, and the market capitalism is on the defensive.
Correct.
And in a way, rightly so. We had gone too far. The needle had gone too far, and now we are swinging back. And I hope we don't swing back too far, back to the license Raj. But nevertheless, I think that this is a good time to be talking about Gandhi's ideas, because they are very relevant to our dilemmas today. And the insight he had on, you know, talking about stakeholders. Before, we used to only talk about shareholders, a la Friedman. Now we talk about stakeholders. Now that's very Gandhian to do that. So why don't I turn it over to you at this point, Jerry? Tell us about trusteeship in Gandhi and how is it relevant to us today?
You know, Gurcharan, you said something very important, which is before the word trustee or trusteeship is the word trust. And the Nobel laureate, the French Nobel laureate Tirole writes about this. In the absence of trust, frankly, all civilized commerce, all civilized finance as we know it, disappears. And if there is trust, then your law enforcement costs, etc., come down drastically. You don't need to litigate or fight over everything because there is trust. Gandhi is a very interesting guy because when he talked about the rich holding their wealth as trustees, he actually expanded the entire English common law concept of trusteeship. In English common law, by the way, it's not there in continental law, there is this idea of trusteeship, where I manage wealth for your benefit, for somebody else's benefit, not for my benefit. I have a fiduciary responsibility to manage it for your benefit. And this goes back to medieval England, courts of chancery. There's a hoary history. And remember, Gandhi was a barrister from London. And one of his favorite books was Snell's Equity, which is about trusteeship and the equity law. Equity is where the requirements of justice require that you don't interpret the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law, which is what trusteeship is about. I hold it in trust for you, for others. Now, he could have said to his rich friends, be charitable, be good, be patriotic. He didn't. He said, be trustees. He expanded this notion. It's not me holding money in trust for your children, but all rich people holding their money in trust for a larger purpose. And where are the roots? One, of course, is English common law, Snell's Equity. The second, strangely enough, is the Ishavasya Upanishad, which was Gandhi's favorite Upanishad. And in the opening of the Ishavasya Upanishad, Ishavasyam idam sarvam, yat kincha jagatyam jagate. Everything in the moving universe is imbued with the spirit of the Lord, would suggest that the world does not belong to men, but to the Lord. And therefore, we are trustees of the world itself, which comes to your point of intergenerational trusteeship. And Gandhi got the third root was from the Gujarati Baniya traditions. In Gujarat and Marwar, as you know, it is common for Baniyas to set up panjra poles, to set up step wells, where they are really setting up intergenerational transfers of wealth, because the wealth they are not going to use. It's going to be used for several hundred years. Even in southern India, temple tanks were set up by rich people. So there is this where you hold the water body in trust. It doesn't belong to you. It actually belongs to the Lord. And in fact, the Jains have taken this to an extreme. Every Jain temple belongs to Adinath or Parshvanath. It doesn't belong to the trust or the trustees. They just manage it on behalf of Adinath. The other area where Gandhi derived some of his inspiration was from the Gospels, especially Mark and Matthew, which he was very fond of, and he actually knew them by heart. And he derived this idea that basically, oddly enough, it's easy for the poor to go to heaven. It's very difficult for the rich to go to heaven. Therefore, the rich have to do something. They have to be good trustees. And to answer your question, what percentage? Actually, there is an interview that Gandhi has given this Frenchman, Pierre Cresol, where he said, if a rich man comes and tells me, I'll give you 75% of my wealth, I will take it. I will not insist on taking 100%. Let him keep the other. And Gandhi saw that as a tax from society to take. So he saw this idea. It had to be voluntary, by the way. He was totally opposed to the state expropriating property or taking it away from rich people. The other thing that did kind of influence Gandhi quite considerably was the Gita. And there Gandhi drew a very interesting, he actually, Scott Barton talks about it. Gandhi's interpretation of the Gita comes a lot from Edwin Arnold's translation, the song Celestial. And Edwin Arnold was a high Anglican Protestant kind of guy. So there is a correlation with Gandhi's own ideas and Weber's Protestant ethic, where he felt that wealth should be accumulated by rich people, not as an end in itself, but as a service in the service of God. And he put all these two together. And to end with your point about stakeholder, he's the first guy, by the way, who talked about the tripod. No other economist before Gandhi had talked about customers. There are hundreds of books about capital versus labor fighting. Gandhi said the customer is the third in the triangle, in the element. And in fact, the customer will keep both capital and labor honest. And capital and labor, he saw it as a creative tension between these three, where everybody keeps everyone else honest and the economy progresses. So there were very interesting areas from which he derived his thoughts. And there was very interesting ways in he came up with trusteeship. Now, today, particularly in the post-2008 era, when we are revisiting the foundations of market capitalism as we know it, my plea is that too many of the responses are technocratic. Let's pass a new law. Let's introduce 2-3 more regulations, appoint 5 more independent regulatory agencies, fine a few people. And that's probably necessary. I'm not denying the place for that. But I think unless we revisit this in a more fundamental sense, we are going to have a problem either justifying market capitalism to the people at large, or even being able to live with the kind of economic and political freedoms that we now today take for granted, because the opponents will say, you guys are not working, you guys are a bunch of crooks, and therefore we have a right to curtail and imprison you and change
but
the system.
Jerry, let me ask the question from the perspective of a guy who builds a very good business. He's the founder, the promoter, and builds a very fine business. And he feels that here's this lifetime labor that he has done. And you're telling him, you know, this is not yours. This belongs to society. And the guy says, are you crazy? My sweat and blood went into building this enterprise. I created thousands of jobs. And you're saying that it doesn't really belong. I'm a kind of trustee. How do you respond to that guy?
Oh, no. Gandhi dealt with this head on. First of all, he is very clear that the money belongs to the person who created it, who created the wealth. And he is saying that, frankly, he's not advocating trusteeship from society's perspective. He's advocating it from the rich man's perspective. He's saying you will be making a mistake if you give excess money to your children. You will spoil them. You will make them into drunkards and lazy people. And he's saying it's in your interest to look at your wealth as trust, A, to go to heaven, and B, in order not to spoil your children. The second point, he's a very clever psychoanalyst, Gandhi. He's not to be underestimated at all. That's why I was extremely glad, actually, when our current Home Minister referred to him as a Chaturbanya, because that is what he was. He was an extremely intelligent Vanikaputra. He used to frequently refer to himself as a Banya. And he was not suggesting something impractical, something that the entrepreneur is going to reject. He was saying, fine, if you don't do it, don't do it. But consider this in your own interest. Then, after having said that, all the moral ground, he comes to a very kind of practical ground. By the way, if you don't do something about it, there are poor people out there who might attack you and take your wealth away. And you will have to employ lots of guards to defend yourself. So he's got a way of trying to say that wealth is good, creation of wealth is good, accumulation of wealth is good. But the point you made about how you spend it is equally important, because wealth is instrumental. If you spend it foolishly, then it is not of great value, it has to be spent wisely. And giving a large portion of it to your children, according to Gandhi, is not a very wise way of spending it. It is, in fact, not even in the interests of the children. He's saying,
this was, of course, what Fabian socialists, the central idea in Fabian socialism really was that, okay, when you die, your children don't have a right. And therefore, they had these very high death duties. You remember?
Correct.
Very high death duties. Even America today, 50% goes to the state,
Yeah,
because
Gandhi was closer to the Quakers, actually. The Quakers, not only were they some of the earliest opponents of slavery and so on, and prison reform, they also have extremely negative connotations associated with inherited wealth. And in fact, they use the word stewardship. They don't use the word trusteeship.
Yeah.
Stewardship is a common Quaker word. And Gandhi was very close to the Quakers. In fact, when he went to the Roundtable Conference in London, his first public speech was at the Quaker Friends' house. And he was very close to them. And there's a lot in common between Quaker thought and many of the great ethical businessmen of England, Rowntree, Cadbury, Barclay, Reckitt. They were all Quakers.
Right.
And they believed in stewardship.
Yeah, Jerry, let me come back.
Sorry.
I was just coming back to Jerry's question of the agency problem. Because, you and I, Jerry, were both executives at one time, meaning we were trustees of wealth. We were not owners of wealth. You later went and became a capitalist. So you became an owner of wealth. And I always remained as what we would call the Kshatriya. The Punjabi Khatri is a counselor. And I'm a counselor, whereas I'm not a banya. And so I'm not the owner of capital. And of course, this is the mistake that Rajat Gupta made and got himself into trouble. Here he was head of McKinsey. He was a counselor all his life. He was a Kshatriya. And then after he retired, he had only $150 million in the bank. But he was moving around in a circle where his poorest friend was a billionaire. So that's 1,000 million. So he felt very poor. And therefore, I think, poor guy, he got into trouble believing that he should be a little more richer. But with the confusion between being a Kshatriya, meaning a counselor, a trustee, versus a owner, a capitalist, a banya. Anyway, I just wanted to put this sidelight. I interrupted Shekhar, who was about to...
Gandhi has dealt with these issues head on.
So let me bring Gandhi also to present context. First of all, in today's debate on political economy, in fact, there's hardly a debate because today political economy is being led in a direction with almost no debate. Where would Gandhi be? Which side would Gandhi be on this side of political debate? And second, you mentioned about Gandhi's inspiration, Gandhi drawing inspiration from Gospels. So I have a question from a young colleague of mine, Raghav Bhikchandani, who says that in the book, you've quoted from Gandhi's 1916 Allahabad speech. So tell us a little bit about the Allahabad speech. And you've said that Allahabad lecture by Gandhi suggests that his economic mindset at that time was a distillation of the Gospels. So what do you mean by that phrase?
See, Gandhi has come back from South Africa. He's taken his guru's advice and is wandering around India, visiting different places. He is now still very much part of the westernized elite. Most of his speeches are in English. He is invited by the Economics Association of Muir College, Allahabad, which is a very elite westernized college, to speak. And he speaks in English. And the speech is an extraordinary speech. Parel, Gurcharan's friend, has done a brilliant analysis of the speech. Parel, by the way, is one of the greatest Gandhian scholars. Without him, my book would have been impossible. But Parel mentions the fact that in that speech, Gandhi has quoted Shakespeare, he has quoted A.R. Wallace, of course, he has quoted extensively from the Gospels. The basic creed that economists had adopted was that religion and economics were separate things. If you want to be successful in commerce, you shouldn't worry too much about religious matters. Gandhi attacks that head on. First of all, he takes away the argument that somehow religious people support poverty. He says that is complete rubbish. Grinding pauperism is morally degrading, and no religious person can support grinding pauperism and poverty. That is not a correct interpretation of religion or religious principles. And then he says, according to Gandhi, the most important phrase in the economic area that Jesus uses, thou canst not serve God and mammon both. The idea is not that you cannot become rich or you should not become rich. In fact, the parable of the talents suggests that you should invest your talents wisely and get rich. But serving, mammon is a god of money. If money ceases to be instrumental and becomes your master, becomes your god, then you are finished, according to Gandhi, from a religious perspective. He goes on to describe Christ as the greatest economist of his age. I think he understands this, that the issue that Gurcharan was talking about both sides, about equity, fairness on the one hand, and the proper use of one's talent. So there's a parable of the talents, which talks about using your God-given talents to improve your life, create more wealth. And there is a Good Samaritan, where you're supposed to be a trustee to your fellow man. So it's that creative tension that Gandhi says those people who try to separate mercantile, business, commercial activity, economics from religion are wrong. There is an intertwining. And by the way, it's interesting, 10 years later or 12 years later, in Kashi, he is now giving a lecture in Hindi on the Bhagavad Gita in the Kashi Vidyapit. See how the man has changed also. It's quite interesting. English, Mayo College, westernized audience, now Hindi, Kashi Vidyapit. And there it's on the Bhagavad Gita. But he brings out a similar idea. He says, wait a minute, nobody is saying karmanyev adhikarasya means you're not interested in the fruit, in getting rewards or the results. Doesn't mean you're doing shoddy work and letting the train run on time. No, the results have to be good. You do not have a craving for the fruits. That's what he means it is. So he continuously evolves. But the 1916 Muir College speech is very, along with Hind Swaraj, it represents a foundational Gandhian text, and it is to Parel's great insight that he picked this up.
I'd just like to add one more thing. I think what you've hinted at, philosophically speaking, Jerry, both from the Gospels as well as from the Gita, the Karmanyev Adhikaraste, that ultimately it boils down to your view of a person's identity. And this is, of course, an old debate in India, but in other places also, that the Upanishads were constantly grappling with this idea, what is a human being? And they came to the conclusion, which Gita encompassed also, but so did ultimately Shankara and others, that the I, the aham, the I-ness, is really a creation of the ego, of the mind. And the real self is the consciousness. And therefore, if you're not obsessed with your I, with your ego, then you will somehow behave better, you'll be closer to being a real, rich, flourishing person, if you will. I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to deny personhood. I mean, Shankara goes, in my view, too far. But I do think that it just boils down to the whole thing. When, I can't, it's very, it's very interesting that the Nazis actually used this Krishna's karma yoga to defend themselves, that they were not acting for their selfish purpose, but for the greater glory of the Reich, of that. And so the idea has been misused. But in ordinary usage, I think if you learn to sort of that I, if you can make that big I into little smaller I, you're in for a better way of living.
Gurcharan, this whole thing of how to deal with the I, because both Adam Smith and Mahatma Gandhi were practical empiricists, they came up with their own strategies which have striking similarity. Gandhi's book, his autobiography, Story of My Experiments with Truth. He was always experimenting. He was empirically trying to feel his way around. How do I deal with this problem? And he came up with this idea that I have to kind of transcend or suppress my one I and go back to my still small voice of conscience, which is my other I within me. And Smith, whose theory of moral sentiments precedes his Wealth of Nations by more than a decade. Most people don't know that Smith was first a moral philosopher before being the founder of political economy. Smith talks about the impartial spectator that each of us envisions outside of ourselves looking at us. So the smaller egocentric I, if you will, gets dissolved by the impartial spectator looking at us objectively and telling us what to do. We, as it turns out, like to do praiseworthy things. But both Smith and Gandhi point out, you don't do praiseworthy things in order to get praise. You do it because they are inherently things that your conscience or your impartial spectator tells you to do. And when it comes to wealth particularly, Gandhi understands this. He understands that wealth can destroy. And if it is not used properly it can actually lead to the egocentric I asserting itself and either excessive hedonism or
Jerry,
Gurcharan, yeah. Go ahead.
I was going to move Jerry to now the more controversial part of the whole story, which is Swadeshi. Is that all right?
Yes,
sir. The fact is that at Gandhi's time, it did play a very big part about creating a sense of nationalism. I remember that one of my aunts actually burnt her sari in Lahore as a part of this whole Swadeshi thing. But it is what we want, what's happening today. We are losing all the ground that we had gained after 91, all the way up to 2015, 2016, when we had brought down tariffs, joined up with the global economy, and we were ready to join the global supply chains, which is what China showed that its success was based. And no country, as you know, as you've said it yourself, no country became truly prosperous and successful without exports in history. And so the notion of Swadeshi today sounds like an anachronism. Over to you.
Gurcharan, my book is...
I also have a connected question with one of my young colleagues, Nikhil Rampal, who says there is no doubt Mahatma Gandhi believed in a self-reliant India, Atmanirbhar Bharat. Do you think that in a world where interdependence on each other benefits countries more, the idea of self-sufficiency or Atmanirbharta is a bit dated?
Okay. See, my book is about the intellectual history of Gandhian thought. And to the extent it may have some insights into the current political debate, I will share them. But I think I will begin by trying to explain Gandhi's position on Swadeshi. First of all, Swadeshi movement predates Gandhi. It goes back to 1905 in Bengal, when he was still in South Africa. So it's not as if Gandhi started the Swadeshi movement. The idea that you should use Indian goods and not imported goods predates his arrival into India. 2, Gandhi in Hind Swaraj basically bought into the ideas of Dadabhai Navroji and Ramesh Chandra Dutt that there had been a systematic drain of Indian wealth by having tariffs that were discriminatory against Indian goods and in favor of British goods. Not that there was free trade. And also, the exchange rate was deliberately manipulated to work against Indian manufacture and to sustain the British ICS officers' pensions. So essentially, having bought into that theory, and there are Tathagata Roy, others have some differences about that theory, but that was the mainstream idea at that point in time. Gandhi, his entire life was devoted to the dismantlement of the empire, which meant he had to take a position on this economic drain and what it was doing to us. And therefore, he was never a grievance monger. His idea was not simply complain to the British, hey, you're doing bad things to us. Yeah, you can complain, but what are we doing about it? And that is where he started. He went one step further than the Swadeshi movement. He said, let's actually go to handloom and hand spun. And in that, there was a very interesting thing. Many of his supporters were Ahmedabad mill owners. So when he goes for handloom, is he going against the textile mills? Even the Ahmedabad Labor Union were his friends. He was their leader for some time. So he was actually working against his friends when he was going for handloom. I think again, typical Gandhian way of kind of squaring the circle, he managed to do that very interestingly. Most of his most lyrical passages are not about the loom. They're about the charka, about spinning, which is a machine, by the way. Everybody says he was anti-machine. Charka is a machine at the end of the day. And he was concerned that charka actually gives us better tinkering skills, better eye-hand coordination, fine motor skills. And he was in the James, I've argued in my book, in the James Watt Scottish tinkering tradition, and that's why he liked the charka. Now, what would his ideas be vis-a-vis today? It's kind of difficult to say, Gurcharan, because Gandhi was so enigmatic. It's very difficult to say what the old man, how he might have reacted to a specific situation. But in general, he was not opposed to Indian industry being globally competitive. He was supportive of it. When he went with William Shirer to Manchester, he told Shirer, hey, look at these antique British textile machines. All the factories in Ahmedabad are so much more modern than them. No wonder these Lancashire guys can't compete. So he was pretty much en courant. And when the Scindias launched their first kind of Indian commercial ship, he was very supportive. He knew that was being built in some shipyard somewhere in the world. But he wanted Indian shipping to do well. So, but in very specific exact questions, it's difficult because he was also quite unpredictable. Let's be clear about it.
I'll take one more question from a colleague of mine, Fatima Khan, and this is not to do with Gandhi, the economist, Jerry. Fatima wants to know, she says, in the last few years, lots has been written about Gandhi as an indictment of his politics. Liberals especially have questioned his problematic stance on caste, on women empowerment, on his personal relationships with women in his life. So what do you make of these criticisms?
Okay, I as it is, although my book is Economist Gandhi, interspersed here and there, some of these issues have been tackled. Let us start with caste. I recommend to your colleague to read Nishikant Kolge's book on Gandhi and caste. Now, he, as well as Rajmohan Gandhi, Ram Gua, all of them have independently argued that if in 1916, on coming back to India, Gandhi had made a speech saying, I don't like caste, he would never have made it in Indian politics. The realistic thing was he had to attack caste slowly and insidiously, not head on, because if he had done it head on, he was going nowhere. Number two, if you look at my chapter on identity economics, because we all derive some utility, even in the Benthian sense of utility, from our identity. My identity as a schoolboy, my identity as an athlete. And Gandhi inverted caste identities. Till then, most people, including Dalits, were advising other Dalits, become pure in your habits, give up dirty jobs, and elevate yourself to change your identity, which was very much in keeping with the general British view that Indians should imitate the British if they wanted to progress, which Gandhi bitterly opposed in Hind Swaraj. Okay, so what did he say? He told his upper caste people, no, you guys have to clean toilets. If you want to be my disciples, live in my ashram. And you guys have to work with leather, which was again supposed to be a low caste identity marker. In fact, Gandhi used to make chappals himself. He used to work with leather. Despite being a vegetarian and against killing of animals, leather work. So Kolge makes this point. Gandhi inverted the caste pyramid. Now coming to women, when we are talking about, the word Purusha. Purusha, I know in modern Hindi, Purush means man. It has acquired a completely masculine kind of flavor. But the original Sanskrit Purusha is the citadel of dawn, or the fortress of the dawn, of the goddess of dawn. So Gandhi, in fact, says Purusha refers to the person, and he specifically says it includes women when he is talking about Purusharthas. And he wants women to be very much a part of it. Now, of course, particularly his experiments with young women later in life, I don't think anybody has been able to either justify it or to understand it. Neither Shira nor Fisher, nobody has been able to figure it out. Why those seem, and they certainly seem exploitative and incorrect. The only thing you can say in the man's defense is that he didn't hide them. He was quite open about them, but it's not something that one stands up. Now, the racial thing is kind of rather ridiculous, actually. A few Africans have taken some statements he has made and said that he was a racist and so on. These are kind of context-free statements made 200 years later, and I don't think they make any sense to judge. Gandhi's primary job in Africa was to get political rights for his countrymen. In that process, if it meant he was not going to fight for the blacks of Africa, that doesn't make him a bad guy. I mean, this is, I think this woke political correctness has gone too far. And the interesting thing is these woke people, Shekhar, they're trying to pull down both Churchill's statue and Gandhi's statue in front of Westminster Palace, considering that Gandhi and Churchill were lifelong opponents. It's so ironical that they dislike both of them.
Jerry, just to, I think we're running out of our time. And so I just wanted to make a couple of points. One is that there are certain things that I find I did totally disagree with him, particularly that his stand on celibacy.
Yeah.
I just think that's not being, he's for a pragmatic guy like him. He was a very pragmatic man. That this was really came out of that. And this, I think, goes back to that whole influence of Tolstoy, etc., which is all very, I've analyzed that in my Karma book. Anyway, the point that I was really want to make is the damage to Gandhi has also been done by the Gandhians. And that I think one of the worst things made or worst legislations in modern Indian history made in the name of Gandhi was during the Janta interregnum between Mrs. Gandhi's two periods.
Yeah.
And that was this legislation called the Small Scale Industry Reservation. It came out of also the Small is Beautiful movement. And it led to our making India uncompetitive for next 20 years, 25 years. We got rid of it finally in 2008. So it was around a long time.
Let me come in on that. Gandhi would have opposed that tooth and nail. He was opposed to any economic or social activity which could not stand on its own 2 feet and which required state handouts, subsidies, and protections. Yeah. He hated them.
Yeah, and it was really, you talked about the fact that he actually believed in a competitive India.
Yeah.
And therefore, why I'm opposed to the Swadeshi people today is that they, or even PLI, that it is, I fear, PLI is a good idea, but frankly, those tariffs are much too high. And it will make India uncompetitive. Atmanirbhar has 2 meanings. One, it means self-reliance, which is good. And the other means self-sufficiency, which is bad. We're part of a global economy, and we can't prosper unless we are competitive in that. So that, I think, is
if you look at Gandhi's speech in Lancashire to the mill owners and the mill workers, it's almost as if he's negotiating a free trade agreement with Britain. He was very much in favor of that kind of mutually beneficial trade agreements. And he was not thinking. One thing he was very clear. He repeatedly said, do not give charity to able-bodied people, give them opportunities. So welfareism he was against. He wanted agricultural colleges. His disciple Kumarappa wanted agricultural colleges and engineering colleges to earn revenue on their own, to be largely self-sustaining. Those were his idea of
that's Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah, of protection subsidy is something that was not. And there you go back to Rajni Bakshi's thing. Gandhi's frequent reference to himself as Avanika Putra. He felt that Indian merchants, Indian capitalists, Indian entrepreneurs could compete with the best in the world and stand up. There was no need for these umbrellas of protection.
As a sort of last thought here, Shekhar and Jari, whenever Gandhi's name comes up, I'm always reminded of Andre Malraux's very inspiring characterization of India's independence. He says that India was born in the shadows of Hitler, Stalin, and Mao, created by saints. Now, I think that's really quite an inspiring characterization of India, particularly when you compare that India's 20th century was really relatively peaceful against the rest of the world's 20th century, particularly China's violent 20th century. We escaped the 2 world wars, and it was only partition. And partition also was not state-sponsored violence, the way Mao's violence or Stalin's violence was. What I want to say, though, is that in a way, I think it is also dangerous to put dreamers in power, saints in power. So it is almost fortunate to us that Gandhi decided not to be part of the government.
Right.
And soon he passed away. Nehru did not. Nehru was also a saint. His saintliness lay in a very deep moral sense, in his suffering for the poor, etc., which made him a socialist. Of course, we cannot forgive him for the license Raj, but the impetus is a saintly one. The danger, the damage that Nehru did. People, it's very common to criticize Nehru right now. Everybody's criticizing him, but I think that one criticism is important, and that was the criticism made by Kissinger. Kissinger said in the 50s that, look, this man is harming his own country. And he's saying, why is Nehru espousing the cause constantly of the Chinese? Doesn't he realize that they're not his friends? And he's making an enemy of the West in doing so. And of course, it was proven to be right in that way. This whole bringing morality, of course, Kissinger believed in national self-interest and not injecting morality into politics.
He still does. In fact, he still keeps saying those things. So, Jerry, concluding remarks from you, and also a question from me, a dumb question. If Gandhi were to meet Narendra Modi today, where would he say, well done, beta? And where would he say, you are messing up?
That's an interesting question. I think Gandhi would, and let's stick to economics. I don't want to get sucked into the political side. I think Gandhi would have been concerned about this constantly increasing tax rates up to 42% and so on the rich. Because he realized that if you do that, then wealth creation dries up. And he has said that so many times, it is not funny. And he would have actually tried to take the new education policy a little further in the direction of tinkering, in the direction of including music and things like that. If you look at his Nai Taaleem, he was very particular in including those in the curriculum, including smithy and carpentry, and including gardening. In fact, he would have argued with Modi that if you want to teach environmental science to your children, kindly use gardening as a way, and let them have gardening as a subject in their school. So those are the kinds of areas I think he would not have talked of something immediate. He was looking at a longer term trajectory for the country. And I think he would have given him a copy of Kumarappa's Nai Taaleem of the 1930s and asked him to read it. Kumarappa was a Gandhian economist and a close friend, disciple, and teacher of the Mahatmas, and said, if we want to create a prosperous human capital-led country, let's focus on some of these things. I don't think the anti-rich rhetoric would have appealed to Gandhi. He was very, very conscious. In fact, he says though so many times, if you do that, the rich will just go away. And then the country will be the loser.
And he was not shy about having the friendship of the rich.
Not at all. Whether it was in South Africa, Kallenbach and Pollack, or Jamnalal Bajaj, Ghanshyam Das Birla, Ambalal Sarabhai, Kasturbai Lalbhai in India. No, they were all his friends, and he was he appreciated and understood what value they were bringing to the country. He was not at all. In fact, the people he kind of used to make fun of, he didn't actually ever abuse anyone, very, very rarely. But he used to make fun of the socialists. He found them a little comical. And he used to kind of...
one thing that, Jerry, I didn't find in your book, but I think something once Gandhi remarked about it, it's from the Arthashastra. And Arthashastra, the king is informed that there is a just tax rate. In other words, it's called Shatbhaga, that the king has 1/6, 15% of a right on the share of the produce of the country. Usually it was agriculture mostly then. And Shatbhaga is, 15%. So the fair tax rate, Gandhi never may have, I don't know whether he said it or whether he quoted it.
I haven't come across that.
Yeah.
But let me end with
Singapore's tax rate, by the way.
Let me end with this. I think the important thing, Shekhar, from my perspective, for students and for younger readers today, is to remember that Gandhi is a colossal intellectual figure of the 20th century. He's a very original thinker. He has a global footprint. Whatever we may say, Nehru or Rajagopalachari or Patel are not important for the rest of the world. They may be important for us. Gandhi is important, is a universal figure. And Gandhi matches up to the best in world intellectual traditions. He might be one of our greatest intellectual contributors in a long time. And it is not only about satyagraha, or as some of this young person's friends talk about his experiments with young women in Noakhali, which are the only things today that get any attention. No, it is in a range of intellectual activity which places him with some of the best thinkers from around the world, and is a uniquely Indian contribution. Trusteeship might in fact end up being, it's never a complete answer, a partial and important answer to the problems of modern market capitalism.
But I think on that note, we should conclude this. And I would say that all students of Gandhi, young and old, should check out your book, because this is a very unusual insight on Mahatma Gandhi, because there's almost no debate and discussion. In fact, if I may just use a concluding line, there's a general belief that it's good that Nehru took over India's governance, particularly economic governance, and not Gandhi, because Gandhi would have taken us backwards. Frankly, it might be the opposite in many ways, particularly since by 1955-56, the industrial policy resolution and compulsory licensing, etc., came in. So I think on that note, yes, Gandhi was our greatest. Gandhi is India's greatest brand, modern India's greatest brand, without a doubt. So let there be more scholarship on it. And Jerry, thank you very much for adding to the scholarship with the book. And Gurcharan, thank you so much for adding to this with your thoughts and intellect. And I'll also let our viewers know that Gurcharan is working on his new book now, and it's about, can I say so? It's about moksha.
But a very secular idea of moksha.
Very secular idea of moksha. So let's look forward to that also.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Shekhar. Thanks, Gurcharan. Really appreciate it.